Now that the Egoist League is finally over, and with us now knowing the true level of each player in it, it has never been more fitting for us to build the dream team of the Egoist League. The team that compiles the best players from each participating club, a team that can only be described as the unstoppable force. And when I say compile the best players, I am of course excluding the pros. However, watch until the end because I have a fun surprise regarding the pros. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the NEL's dream team. However, before we jump into the video, I've got an announcement. I have actually opened the channel membership. As you all know, YouTube is my main job, and this is a way for those of you who feel generous to help me continue to give you this content. You absolutely don't have to join in, but I would really appreciate it. However, with that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, let's jump into the dream team. Starting up straight with the formation. Now, before when I created the perfect team to represent Japan in the U20 World Cups, I have actually taken Ego's formation that he used in the U20 game. This time, however, because of a certain player, because this player is such a force on the field, I have modified the formation. As for today's team, we are going to go with 3-4-3 formation. 3 defenders, 4 midfielders, and 3 strikers. And you might think to yourselves, 3 defenders is not enough. However, when we get to the actual defenders and the midfielders, you will understand that it is a no problem. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's start straight up with a goalkeeper, who obviously will be Jenga Gamaro. I mean, who else would be fitting, right? In any case, let's just move on from the obvious stuff and move straight up to the defensive line. As the sole center back, we have the guy that forced this formation to be. Of course, I'm talking about none other than the Italian Don, Lorenzo. As you all know, Lorenzo is such an oppressive defender on the field, and honestly he deserves to warp the formation so it suits his playing style, as frankly he is the best defender we've seen as of yet. And not only that, in addition to being the best defender, he is actually top 3 when it comes to playmaker, as Isagi deducted in the Ubers game. After a while, he realized that Lorenzo is the beating heart of Ubers with the help of Nico, and so to be frank, his inclusion is a no-brainer. Next, on his left, we have the second best defender in the league, Oliver motherfrickin' Aiku. Now, if Lorenzo is that immovable object, if Lorenzo is simply described as phenomenal, Aiku is described as the complete package when it comes to defending. He is the perfect defender. And what do I mean by that? First, he has insane perception, he has metavision and an insane analytical eye on top of that allow him to dominate the grounds completely. Then there is the fact that he is so potent in the air that honestly he seems like an unfair defender, and the only reason he is not the focal point of the defensive line is because Lorenzo is just that OP. On the right, however, we have the dark horse of this defensive line, Ryu Jubei. Now, Ryu serves 2 purposes. First, he can completely dominate high flyers like we've seen him do with Kunigami. And even on the ground, despite him not having the greatest of perceptions, his reach is still enough for him to be one of the best defenders ever, as evident with him stopping Sai and Kunigami multiple times in the Ubers game. But with that, the defensive line is set, and it's time for us to move to the midfield. Now, for the defensive midfielder, it's honestly again a no-brainer. There isn't really a better player than Karasu Tabito. You see, before, I would have happily given this position to another player, say Raichi or Ryo. However, after the midpoint where Karasu unlocked Metavision, he honestly became such a force in the midfield. I mean, scratch that, even before, he was keeping up with Rin and Charles, 2 players with insane visions, and he was doing it no problem. And he was one of the reasons Kaiser failed the way he did before he rebelled. Now, all of this got really boosted by him acquiring Metavision, where he literally became a menace on the field, rivaling even the likes of Hiyori and Isagi in their field readability. And honestly, this alone is enough to grant him the position. However, Karasu also has the best dueling ability in Blue Lock other than dribblers. He has the best ball keeping and retention, and we've seen him dominate almost any player one-on-one, with the exception of course being Kaiser due to his quick plays. Now, while Karasu is an obvious choice, the rest of the midfielders aren't as easy. First, on the left, I have chosen a player that can bridge the gap between the defensive line and the strikers. And he does that very effortlessly because he is one of the best geniuses we have. And also he is a player that demonstrated an insane ability to defend. But also he was able to score all on his own. Even with his own team playing for another player, he alone shined due to his speed. Of course, I'm talking about Chigiri Hiyoma. Now, to be honest, I would have loved to put him as a striker. However, I think he is going to link perfectly with the striker he will have on the left. As for why I chose Chigiri, as I said before, he's a very reliable winner, and also Chigiri is a player that can very easily score. He can take a whole team by surprise. Then there is the fact that we've seen him multiple times use his speed to defend. And while he was weak against Metavision players like Sai and Isigi, he was amazing against players with a Predator eye since he can sneak up behind them and show up at the last moment, like we've seen him do with Kaiser and Baro. As for the right side, I really had a lot of thoughts regarding this position. The obvious choice actually would be Bachira, since he is just like Chigiri, however instead of speed he has dribbling. However, I think Bachira is very lackluster when it comes to defense. And also the forward line is so OP that more firepower isn't really necessary. And so I decided to go with a player who can feed those strikers insane passes. Of course, I'm talking about Yo Hiyori. Now, to be honest, Hiyori demonstrated his ability to work with any striker, and he also demonstrated an ability to forward the ball to them regardless of the situation. Whether he is pressed by 3 players, or even while being pressed by insane players like Nico and Karasu, he still forwarded the ball regardless of anything. And I think this, in addition to his insane vision and his amazing dribbling, really makes him a very worthy player of taking this position. And here we reach a point. We can't really choose Hiyori without choosing his partner in crime, Charles Cavalier, who will take the final position in the midfield as the cam of the team. Now think about what Hiyori can do, and then multiply all of that times 10. And so much like Lorenzo and much like Carasso, he is a very obvious inclusion. However, with that we are done with the midfield. And we move to the real stuff. We move to the really spicy picks, as we are, ladies and gentlemen, entering the strikers territory. Now, on the right, I am going to say it straight up. I'm choosing Isigi motherfreaking Yoichi. And I really should not say anything about him, like you already know about what he can do. However, I'd say this. Isigi playing with Hiyori was amazing. Now imagine him playing with Charles. If you thought what Charles did with Shidou and Rin was amazing, then I can't even begin to describe what Charles can do with a player that can understand him fully in Isigi. And so, to be honest, Charles alone grants Isigi a position. However, as you all know, in addition to that we have Hiyori, and so he is a very mandatory inclusion. As for the striker on the left, since we included Isigi, we gotta include the only player on his level, which is Michael Kaiser. Now think of Kaiser as an upgraded version of Isigi, but without adaptability. I mean, he has better shooting, better speed, and all of that. However, Isigi beats him with his adaptability. And as I said, if you thought what Charles did with Shidou and Rin is amazing, I can't begin to describe what he can do with Michael Kaiser. And fun fact, since now we are speaking about Isigi, Kaiser and Charles, it is time for me to tell you why 3 defenders is enough. First of all, we have Chigiri, who has a tendency to go back. Then we have Hiyori, Kaiser, Isigi and Charles, all players with amazing field readability and all players with perfect positioning, which allows them more than often to be really amazing defenders. And so this, in addition to Lorenzo and Aiko, we get the best iron wall any club would dream to have. However, we are not done yet, since we still have one position left, the true striker of the team. Now, much like the case with Bachira, the first player that comes into mind is obviously none other than Ren. I mean, there isn't really a more dominant player. However, Ren comes with a very steep cost, which is his nasty ego and his volatility. You see, in the PXG game, Rin ended up being the player who cost them the game. First by not passing to Shidou and being the bigger man, even though he was pressed by both Kaiser and Isigi, and then by defending horribly against Isigi even though he saw that Shidou is on Kaiser. And I've seen a lot of you guys telling me that Isigi pushed them there, however we can see clearly in this panel that Isigi ran from a different direction. It was Rin who chose Kaiser specifically because Ness had the ball. Had he had the slightest of trust in Shidou, he would have thought about staying on Isigi. And for this reason specifically, and due to his volatility, I can't really include Rin. Instead, I am going to have the second best pure striker, which is Baro Shoei. Now, you could make an argument that Baro is the same as Rin. However, you gotta think about it this way. Baro is the ultimate key of breaking from tough situations. Think back to every game we've seen him play. Baro has always been the player to break the status quo. He's always been the player to force a goal when all hope is lost. We've seen this against Ren in the second selection, we've seen this in the U20 game, and then we've seen this against Kaiser and Isagi in the Ubers game. And then there is another fact. Baro has the ability to be a team leader, unlike Ren who completely wrecked PXG. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are done with the main team, and it's time for us to figure out the substitutions for each player. And for that, let's start from the top. First, for Baro, I think there is one fit-in striker, which is none other than Shidou. I think with Hiyori and Charles on the field, if it wasn't for Baro, I think Shidou is the perfect player to play with Isagi and Kaiser. Whom, speaking of which, for Kaiser I have Ren as the replacement. I mean, as I said, Ren has his problems, but I still think he is such an oppressive player that he deserves a spot on the team. Then on the other hand, for Isagi I have Nagi Seishiro. I think after the Manshine vs FC Barca game he will reawaken, and then we will see the beast that is known as Nagi Seishiro. And of course, because we are choosing Nagi, it is a no-brainer. We are going to choose Ryo as the left midfielder in place of Hiyori. On the left, however, instead of Chigiri, I am going to choose the next best speedster, which is of course Yukimiya Kenyu. Now, the sinking ship really did not do anything substantial in the PXG game. However, I think that was due to the presence of Kaiser and Isagi, as Yuki is still one of the best one-on-one players, especially with him recently unlocking the Predator Eyes. However, for the cam of the team, and because we already chose Hiyori for the main lineup, I think the only fitting substitution for Charles is none other than Alexis Ness. I really cannot place Ness above Charles and Hiyori, and so he will be included as a substitute. As for the defensive midfielder, there is only one player that I think it is fitting to replace Karasu, especially with Ryo being taken already, and that player is Kunigami Rensuke. Now, you might think that Raichi is also fitting as a defensive midfielder, however, I have a better position for him, which is being Aryo's substitute as the right defender. And to be honest, all of this is out of desperation. There isn't really a better choice, to be honest. Defenders don't usually matter, and so I don't know what to tell you guys. On the left side, however, replacing Aiku, we have Nico Iki, which is a very fitting replacement, as I think Nico is the Wormod's version of Aiku. As for replacing Lorenzo, I honestly have no idea. There isn't really any player that could replace him. And also we run to another problem. As you have noticed probably, I have not included Bachira at all. And I think that's all due to Nagi. And so, if you think for Isagi Bachira is a better replacement, then I totally agree. And in fact, I think that's more fitting, because if that's the case, we can put Ryo as a replacement for Lorenzo, simply because Ryo is the most versatile player in all of Blue Lock. And replacing Ryo as the right midfielder, we have the shadow of Bachira. Of course, I'm talking about Otoya. And finally, we have the goalkeeper. Now, the obvious choice will be Fukaku, the U20 team former goalkeeper. However, I think there is a better goalkeeper in the NEL. In fact, he is the only goalkeeper in addition to Gagamaru to have actual feats. I'm talking about the goalkeeper of FC Barca, who has the impressive feat of stopping Kunigami's righty shots. However, with that, we are finished with the substitute and we are done with the whole team. And now, it's time for the Easter egg. Let's create a team that actually includes the master strikers. I know they are really oppressive, however, this should be fun. First, for the formation. Because there aren't really defenders among the master strikers, I think this formation will stand. For the defensive line, I think there will be no changes. It's going to be Lorenzo at the center, Aiko on the left, and Aryo on the right. Then, for the defensive midfielder, here I am going to throw a curveball and I am going to choose Snuffy. Simply because we already have 4 other insane strikers, I don't really think we need Snuffy up there. Actually, we need Snuffy to be the one that coordinates everything. And so, the position of the defensive midfielder, which is the same position he took in Uber's Berserk formation, is fitting for him. Next, for the midfield. On the left and replacing Chigiri, I am going to have Loki. Then on the right, I am actually going to keep Hiyori. And this goes for the cam as well, where I am going to keep Charles. I think Hiyori and Charles will play wonderfully with the other strikers. In fact, I don't think that. That will happen. And so for the strikers. On the right, I am going to have Levi, simply because Loki is on the left, and so there is no need for a dribbler to be on the same wing as a speedster. Then on the left, of course, we have Chris Prince. And finally, as the main striker, we are going to have Noah. Now, as you probably have guessed, this list is kind of broken, to be honest, and I really feel pity for any team going against this one. However, it also was a very easy list simply because the pros are so insane at what they do, they are kind of a no-brainers. And so, that's the final list for you guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video. However, with that, until next time, thank you for watching.